Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a session on Kashrut, on Halakha. We are going to focus tonight on what's known as Glatt, or in other words, known as Halak. Okay, both words meaning smooth. Glatt in Yiddish, and Halak is smooth. So obviously, no surprise that we Sfaradim use the word Halak, whereas Ashkenazim use the word Glatt. But because Glatt is what everyone uses, I'm going to be using that. It's not my preference for Yiddish. It's just my preference for something which we're more familiar hearing what it sounds like. But we do hear Halak a little bit, as known as Halak Bet Yosef, which we hear from time to time, especially in Israel. So, with that introduction, we have this opening pasuk in Shemot and Parashat Mishpatim, and it says, "Va'anshe Kodesh tihun li," you shall be a holy people to me, or a holy men to me, ubasar basadeh terefa lo tochelu, and meat which is torn in the field you shall not eat. You shall throw it to the dogs. And from there I would say, okay, carrion we don't eat. However, Chazal, our rabbis, learn from that it's not just carrion or animals which are torn in the field by a predator, but any manner of defects or issues would also have a similar status, and would be a problem for those as well, and they too would have this problem and would require some form of making sure that we're not eating trefa. Now, this is another important phrase. In Ashkenazic parlance, people use the word treif, something which is not kosher. It's not really true. Trefa means an animal which did not die of natural causes because it had a blemish, which either internal or external. So it could have been torn apart by an animal, or it could be that it had a disease or a wound or an issue which would cause it to be passed away within 12 months. Such an animal we're not allowed to eat. Now, all that being said, does that mean we have to check for everything and anything? And the answer is that's not true either. We only check those things which are commonly found to have an issue. But something which is not commonly found to have an issue, we do not need to check. And this is found codified in the Gemara, or not codified, but is taught in the Gemara, in Masechet Chulin on 11a. And it says here, Mena hamilta de'amor rabanan zil bata ruba minaran. How do we know that we follow this position of going after the majority? I.e., we can rely on most animals are kasher, and therefore we don't need to check them. Dichtiv, from the pasuk, acharei rabim lahatot, you shall incline after the majority. Ruba de'ita kaman, that's only dealing with examples where they are in front of you. Kagon teshachan rayot v'sanhedrin. If you have a case of examining 9 butchers, you can rely on the majority. And if you find a kosher piece of meat, I can rely that that it's most likely, if I had 9 out of 10 stores are kosher, it's likely that the piece of meat came from one of the 9 kosher stores and didn't come from the 10th, which was non-kosher. Similarly, with the Sanhedrin, we can rely on the majority of the judges in determining the ruling. We don't need to have all three or all in the case of 3 judges, or when there's more like 23 or 70, we don't need to have full consensus. We go after the majority. But when something is not before us, when do we raise the difficulty? Ruba deleta kaman, when the thing is not in front of us. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar, Rav Acha bar Yaakov said, Ati Mesir Mishtaleh. Let's learn this out from the goat, which is sent away on Yom Kippur. The Rachmana Amar, because the Torah says, "V'lakachet shnei asirim," you have to have 2 goats. Seu shnehem shavim, and both of them have to be equal. Says the Gemara, "Leichush dilma chad minahu trefahu." What happens if internally one of those animals, although they look identical externally, what happens if internally one of them had a trefa? And Allah mishum da'amrin until bataruba. Even in that case, we go after the majority, and we say the majority of animals are kasher inside, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. That's true if I was to stop here. Unfortunately, there are some trefot which require a great deal of preparation. And one of those trefot is checking the lungs. The lungs have a high issue of lesions, and that's something which we need to check and get involved in. So it says here in source number 3, V'ha milta samchinan v'lo batkinan kol yudchet trefot. And this rule that we rely on, that we don't need to check all animals, that's for the 18 normal signs of a trefa. But nekuvat hariyah, the perforation of the lung, mishum deshchiach ba riuta, but kinan, since this is a very common riuta problem or deficiency, but kinan, we must check it out. We must examine to find out if an animal has a problem with its lungs. And if the animal has a problem with its lungs, it's going to be a trefa, and it's not going to be kasher. Even if it's a kosher animal, even if it's had proper shechita, the trefa will make it unfit for consumption. Okay, so far so good. The Mishnah continues. These wounds constitute a trefa in an animal, which render them prohibited for consumption. And it lists them, a lung that was perforated or that was missing a part of it, that renders it a trefa. And Rabbi Shimon says, it is not a trefa, and it is perforated through to the bronchi. Okay? Okay, so it's a little bit more specific. Now here, this is a very complicated piece by the Bar Tanura, who's a commentary on the Mishnah. And we'll read this one in English. He says, a lung that was perforated. The lung contains 2 thin membranes. If one is perforated but not the other, it's still kasher. But if both are perforated and the air escapes from the lungs when they are inflated, then it's a terefa. Based on the idea of a lung that has been perforated, all of the adhesions in the lungs are forbidden when they are found in places that will be detached, since there is no adhesion without a perforation. Since the lung inhales all types of liquids, and the liquid becomes thick inside and emerges little by little through the hole, and it congeals and becomes a membrane. When the adhesions are in a place that will not become detached, such as the lobes that are in order, one protects the other and it becomes healthy again, and the hole is not revealed. But when they are in a place that will be detached, the membrane disintegrates and the perforation is revealed. Then he says, what if it's missing? E.g., one of the 5 lobes of the lung was missing. But if you look at the Bar Tanura, he writes there that sometimes there is no puncture or hole readily noticeable in the animal's lung, but yet there's a visible sircha, there's a lesion or an adhesion. These lesions are a potential sign that there was a puncture nearby that was then removed. The Rishonim dispute the exact problem of sircha, and Rashi explains it here in the following, in the Gemara below. Rava says, Hane tarte one desarichan lahadade late lehu betika. These two lobes of the lung that adhere to one another have no need for inspection, since it's certain that these adhesions arose due to perforation of the lung, rendering the animal a trefa. Velo amran ela shelo kesidran. And we say this halacha only with regard to adhesions that are out of order. But when the adhesions are in order, that is normal. That's the normal way of growth. And the animal there is kasher. Rashi on that point adds, adhesions results on account of a perforation. I told you, I'm sorry that this is very technical. He writes, it's because the lung inhales all types of liquid, and the liquid becomes thick inside like pus, and it emerges little by little through the hole, congeals and turns into a membrane. I found this explanation in the response of the Gaonim. And then he explains that what does it mean that the two lobes are out of order. They were joined together with an adhesion on top of or underneath the middle one. According to Rashi, the sircha or the lesion is a result of a perforation in the lung. Tosafot, on the other hand, holds that a sircha can sometimes develop when there's no perforation, as it may result from liquids that gather there. And the reason why a sircha renders the animal terefa is that it will ultimately become punctured. So if you have a look here, according to Rashi, the mere presence of the sircha or the adhesion means there's a perforation in the lung and it's already a trefa. According to Tosfot, what it means is it's the beginning sign. It doesn't mean yet that it has become punctured as of yet. And he says there, Tosfot, it would seem that one can explain that a sircha can develop anywhere on the lung without a perforation, since it ingests all types of liquids. And the reason why it is a trefa when the lesion caused two lobes to adhere to each other, not in order, is that it will ultimately tear apart. So it's considered to be punctured now, since it will ultimately become punctured. So here, that's what says it's still a trefa, even though it's not yet punctured, because we know eventually it will cause that puncture. And you see here in the book a very complicated diagram in Hebrew, which has all of these things explained, which is beyond the scope of this class, and another one here explaining the lobes. Again, you can send me private questions, but I'm not going to go into it too deeply. This is beyond our session. He continues here, our notes, and says, despite the seriousness with which the Rishonim treated a sircha, it's not clear that all lesions are considered problematic. Some claimed that if you would gently rub a sircha and it dissolves, it's indicative that it's not a problematic lesion, showing that there was a perforation according to Rashi, or that it would have caused a perforation in the future, as we saw the difference between Rashi and Tosfot. But other Rishonim protested against Shochtim, who tried to rub the lesions they found in the lungs with their hands in order to dissolve them, and claimed that the animal was kasher. The Rashba, Rav Shimon ben Aderet, one of the great Sephardic rabbis of Barcelona, was one of those. And he argued that such actions should not be allowed. And again, we'll see this one. In the English there. You have asked concerning lesions found on one of the places the sages forbade them, whether it is permitted to rub the lesion with one's fingers to see whether it is removed, and we can certify it as kasher. Since about this as well, there is a disagreement. Some permit it and do so, and some forbid. And the Rashba writes, this is also one of the things that you should greatly distance yourselves from, and we have strongly decried those who do so. And if one among us does this after being warned, we remove him from his position. He shouldn't be allowed to be a shochet. That is because we have not found this matter in any place in the Talmud, and we do not know any basis for it. There are some types of rubbing with the hand that even the lung and the bronchi would dissolve from it. The bottom line, do not listen to be lenient about this in any matter at all. So I want to stop here and summarize what's going on. Because this is, as I mentioned before in one of our emails, this is an area where traditionally Sfaradim are much more machmir, are much more strict. And the reason why Sfaradim are strict is because the Talmud does not mention any place, anywhere, this idea of rubbing off the lesion to check that it's kasher. Both Rashi and Tosfot, who are Ashkenazic Rishonim, say the presence of it makes it a trefa. And Rav Shimon ben Aderet, the Rashba, says those who do so deserve to have their shochet license revoked. So it should be a straightforward class tonight. It should be any animal which has a lesion, which is not smooth, should be forbidden. But have a look. The Shulchan Aruch says as follows. This is Maran. Kol makom she'asru sruchat hareah, en hafresh ben sheteh sircha daka kahut hase'ara, ben sheteh ava v'chazaka v'rachba kegudal. V'lo ko'otam shemema'akrim biyad, ve'im nitma'aka tolin lahakel, v'chol hanoheg kein ki'ilu ma'achil treifot liYisrael. Any case where they forbade a sircha of the lung, there is no difference whether the sircha is thin as a thread of a hair or thick, strong, and wide like a thumb, and not like those who press down on it with their hands. If it was pressed down, we rule leniently. But anyone who does so is treated as if he fed trefot, non-kosher animals, to a Jew. Let's stop there for a second, friends. Maran was not mincing words. If the Maran could have been lenient, he would. What did the Maran say there? Rav Yosef Karo said, if you eat such animals where the lesion has been rubbed off, it's as if you are feeding them non-kosher animals. Rav Moshe Isserles, the Rama, says something very different. He says, "V'yesh matirin," and there are those who lenient, "Lemishamesh b'sarchot lo ma'ech bahem," that you can rub the sirchot and press them down. And they say that if a person presses down on a sircha all day, it will not detach. Therefore, any case where it is pressed down, we rule leniently, and we say that it's not a true sircha, but it's just rir, it's just pus. And even though it is a major leniency, and look at how he says there, afal pishu kula gedola, kvar nahagu kol b'nei medinot elu, ve'ein limchot biyadam, me'achar sheyesh lahem ama yismachu. Even though this is a major leniency, all of the people in this country have adopted it, and one should not protest against them since they have what to rely upon. But the bodek must be God-fearing. The one who checks the animal, he must be God-fearing and know how to press down gently. That should not be forcefully detached. And friends, I wanted to share with you with this because sometimes I feel that we Sephardim, present company accepted, of course, who are Ashkenazic, we have an inferiority complex, that we're always lenient, especially on Pesach time, especially with this and with that. We have our chumrot as well. And just as the Ashkenazim have al ma she'yismochu, they have what to rely on. So too, when we have leniencies, we have that to rely on. But as we saw recently in Masechet Eruvin Daf Vav Amud Bet, we should be careful with our leniencies and with our stringencies. We should keep all our stringencies and all our leniencies. We should not go for the leniencies of Sfaradim and the leniencies of Ashkenazim. At the same time, we shouldn't go for all the chumrot. Every stringency, says the Gemara there, is like the fool who walks in the darkness. We should take our leniencies and our stringencies and accept them. That's true for us Sfaradim, and that's true for Ashkenazim. We all have those things which are easier, those things which are more difficult. We should not look for a life which is overly challenging the same way we should not look for a life which is too easy, where it's just easy street every day. This dispute between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah serves as the basis for different opinions regarding this issue between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, reported by Hacham Ovadia Yosef. According to the Sephardic practice, one is obligated to eat meat from an animal whose lungs were totally smooth, what we call Halak in Hebrew or Glatt in Yiddish. On the other hand, the strict Ashkenazi halacha is that the consumption of meat that is not glatt is permitted. Nevertheless, many Ashkenazim are also particular to eat only meat that is glatt, as the Ramah himself says that eating meat that is not glatt is considered a big leniency. So, in the Echavedat, Hacham Ovadia says, therefore, anyone who is fearful of the word of God should be extremely careful about this matter, only to eat meat that is smooth, so that one should not stumble, God forbid, on a possible prohibition of a terefa, according to our master, the Shulchan Aruch, who we Sephardim have accepted his rulings. And is a great mitzvah and holy obligation on Torah scholars and rabbis in our generation to arouse the people in their speeches and caution them not to eat meat that does not have a stamp of being halak. And it is known that many of our God-fearing Ashkenazi brothers who treat his name highly are also very careful about this. In addition, the Gra also adopts the more stringent position of the Shulchan Aruch, as evident from the fact that he quotes the response of the Rashba when he says, the Rashba wrote there that one should not do so, and we remove the butcher who would try to remove the lesions. So what's the position of the OU? Because again, it's nice to go and say, when I'm in Israel, I'm going to eat Halak Bet Yosef, the best Sephardic Kosher. That's hard to find in the United States. The OU says, the Shulchan Aruch describes many types of adhesions in intricate detail, the overwhelming majority of which render the animal a trefa. The Ramah concludes the discussion about lung adhesions with a description of a method of peeling and testing many types of adhesions, thereby resulting in many more animals determined to be kasher. The Ramah himself expressed certain hesitations about aspects of this leniency, but because it had gained wide acceptance and did have a firm basis, he ruled that it could be followed. However, he cautions that the peeling and testing must be performed by an exceedingly God-fearing individual. Because this peeling is mentioned and proved by the Ramah, but not Maran, Sfaradim who follow the Maran are required to eat Halak meat as defined by Maran. Maran is also the author of the Bet Yosef, therefore such meat is termed as Halak Bet Yosef. For Ashkenazim, there is a tradition that a small, easily removable adhesion is defined as a lower class of adhesion, known as a rear, such as pus, and that the presence of up to 2 such small, easily removable adhesions still qualifies the animal as glatt, according to Ashkenazic tradition. Eating glatt is a worthy stringency that avoids potential problems raised by the Ramah's controversial leniency. Should be emphasized that the Ramah's ruling is certainly legitimate, and in theory, even non-glatt meat, if inspected properly, is 100% kasher for Ashkenazim. Today, the OU will only certify meat that is glatt, albeit not necessarily glatt Bet Yosef. An important postscript is that the Ramah's ruling is defined as not applicable to young, tender animals such as lamb, kids, and calves. Therefore, all lamb chops, veal, and other meat from young animals must be glatt Bet Yosef, even for Ashkenazim. Now, I want you to hear that very well. Virtually all meat in the United States is glatt, but that's glatt for Ashkenazim. It's not Halak for Sfaradim. So what we rely on, we Sfaradim, when we go to the QFC or we go to affordable Seattle Kosher, or we go to the co-op and we order our kosher meat, we're not getting Halak Bet Yosef. We are relying on the Ashkenazic position of rubbing. They're not peeling it off, but the rubbing of it off. And it's just something to know. Now, is it something that we should be trying to get? I think it's beyond the Seattle Sephardic power to get Halak Bet Yosef readily available. But I do tell you, when I'm in Israel, I do look for Halak Bet Yosef. But it's something which, it's a challenge. I hope that, I'm just eating the bits where it's rubbed off and it's not peeled off. Based on this standard, the vast majority of meat today in the United States is glatt. Though it's clear from this article, sometimes different standards are used for Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. Some certifications may accept some easily removable adhesions as glatt for Ashkenazim, but not Sfaradim, maintaining Halak Bet Yosef. In other countries, including Israel, there is a large percentage of the meat that is not glatt at all, and Sfaradim as well as Ashkenazim that are careful about keeping glatt must be careful to check the meat purchased to determine whether it is. Now, is it permitted for those who are careful to only eat smooth, to eat from the dishes of those who are not careful? In other words, do those who eat only halak treat non-halak meat as if it were non-kosher and require all the dishes in which non-glatt meat is cooked to be kasher before using? According to the Sefer Kashrut and the Yalkut Yosef, the stringency of glatt is not taken to this extreme, and one would certainly be allowed to eat non-meat food cooked in dishes that were used to cook non-glatt meat. So before I continue, it's not talking here about regular kosher meat we find in America. That's halak or glatt, and they're saying it's fine. We're talking about you're in Israel or another country where they're eating non-glatt meat. Can you eat in that person's home? Here, both the Sefer HaKashrut and the Yalkut Yosef both say you can rely on it, which is another important thing, which I've told you, because this question comes up all the time at Pesach time. Just as Ashkenazim should be able to rely on Sephardic food, provided they're not given kitniot, so too, someone who's strict about glatt meat, he can eat off the dishes of someone who doesn't eat glatt, provided they don't give him such meat. Okay? Questions until this time? Or is it all pretty straightforward? Hands up, good? Okay.
So if I understood correctly.
Yes, Sarah.
So if an Ashkenaz ate at a Sephardic home and they had rice and let's say they cooked chicken, if they're separate, you can eat the food, you can eat the chicken or meat, but if they have it together, let's say, like casserole or so on, then you can't eat that combination, correct?
That's correct. So you should be careful if they serve it to you together. But if they know they're having Ashkenazi guests and they're not making kitniot and they're having you over, it's fine. Just as the Sfaradim can come to your home and rely on the numerous Ashkenazic leniencies that you may implore, because you are keeping kashrut according to the Ramah, and they're keeping kashrut according to Maran.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Great
Rabbi?
question. Yes, Jerry.
Do you know that Jonathan Ben Zaken sells meat? His meat is Bet Yosef.
Yes, that's correct. So we do. There is able to get there. You can get some Bet Yosef. That's true. That is true.
But you have to order it directly from him. I don't know that it's available in any butcher shop.
Yeah, yes, and that's an interesting scenario what you're bringing up, Jerry, because on the one hand, it's a higher level of inspection of the lungs. On the other hand, it uses hind quarter meat sometimes, which is permitted for Sfaradim, but not for Ashkenazim. So on the one hand, it has a higher hechsher. On the other hand, Ashkenazim are not accustomed to eating it. So it's a very interesting item, which I've talked about a lot of times, but Jonathan's meats are very delicious, and we do enjoy them in our house from time to time when I'm eating red meat. Moving on, we're going to talk about Glatt chickens. Okay, you may have heard of this oxymoron before. The previous discussion regarding whether meat must be glatt or not pertains entirely to animals such as cows. By contrast, it is generally assumed that chickens do not have to be checked for problems with their lungs, since the lungs of a chicken almost never contain lesions or perforations. And this is the accepted practice in the United States and most other countries today. Nevertheless, the Khatam Sofer writes that if there is a reason to believe that a chicken's lung may be a trefa, one should indeed inspect it. So I just want to say that. The reason why glatt chicken sounds so silly is because they don't need to be checked. However, the Khatam Sofer says if you know there's a reason to check it, because perhaps the chicken has been eating things which we know may cause lesions on its lungs, then that rule becomes, I've got to check it, and therefore it has a glatt issue. So it says here, the Khatam Sofer writes, in truth, a bird that was clawed by a predator and remained alive for 24 hours, we say that it does require inspection. And we asked in Masechet Besah whether it is permitted to slaughter it on Yom Tov. And the Ran writes it is biblically uncertainty to slaughter it on Yom Tov. It says it may not be kasher, and to slaughter on Yom Tov is only permitted if one can eat it. It is evident that the Ran holds that a bird that was clawed requires inspection min ha-Torah, or perhaps granted that there is no majority, as it left the majority since it was clawed, and can no longer be assumed as part of the majority that there are no defects. Nevertheless, perhaps we establish it on the original presumption, as until now it had a presumption of being kasher, and if so, the inspection is only a stringency. The reason being that any chazakah that is not based on a majority, one can investigate, one must investigate, at least on a rabbinic level. So to explain that, according to the Khatam Sofer, since the bird in question was clawed by a predator, there's good reason to believe it's now a trefa, and we have to examine it, either on a Torah level or at least on a rabbinic level. This is relevant in Israel today, where a significant number of chickens are found to have defects in the lungs that render them trefot. As a result, it would seem that perhaps chickens in Israel should ideally have their lungs open and checked following the shechita. This is one of the differences between the higher level hashkachot in Israel, where many or all of the chickens are indeed checked for defects in the lungs. And so therefore, whereas the Rabbanu hashkachot, only a small amount of chickens are checked as a sample. For this reason, Sefer HaKashrut recommends purchasing chickens in Israel bearing one of the higher level hashgachot. Okay, that's what he says there in source number 17. If you stop here, which is our natural breaking point, we see that we have exercised and off a number of issues which have come up in the past. Number one, we found out that glatt really means halak, which means smooth. We found out that Sephardim can indeed be more strict than Ashkenazim from time to time. We found out that we should all keep our stringencies and our leniencies depending on our tradition. We found out that Ashkenazim can eat in Sephardic homes and Sephardic people can eat in Ashkenazic homes, provided that they are giving them food which they can be eaten. We found out that, yes, there is such a thing as glatt kosher chickens, because chickens now are checked for their lungs, because chickens may end up eating things which could cause lesions there. And we found out that although it wasn't a practice amongst the rabbis of the Talmud during the Rishonim period, and in later on, the Ashkenazic practice developed to rub with the fingers or even peel off the lesions and eat them. But nonetheless, the main practice both of Ashkenazim and Sephardim is to eat halak, smooth, or glatt meat. Just at the levels of glatt or halak seems to be that Sephardim are more stricter than the Ashkenazic definition. Any questions until now? All right, we'll stop here, and next time we'll have a look at livers and some other topics. Have a great night, everyone.